This one now is our final keynote, as I said, and that is why the financial sector is key to tackling the climate crisis. Our guest is Jeanne Martin, Head of Banking Programme at ShareAction. If you welcome her to the stage.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here today. As Neil just said, my name is Jeanne, and I'm Head of Banking Programme at ShareAction. In case you do not know us, we are a UK-based responsible investment charity that campaigns for financial institutions to take responsibility for their impact on people and planet. We focus on a range of issues, including good work, biodiversity, and other things, but I personally focus on climate. So hopefully today I'll convince you that financial institutions are key to averting the climate crisis. But let's begin with a couple of questions. When you think about your impact on the climate, what immediately comes to mind? Is it the flights that you take? Is it the miles driven in your car? Or is it the food that you consume? These are all important considerations, and they play a crucial role in our efforts to combat climate change. However, there's another aspect that often gets overlooked, and that aspect is money. We all understand that climate change is happening. In recent years, we've witnessed extreme weather events, melting ice caps, rising temperatures. We know that the stakes are high, and there's an urgent need for action. We must transition away from fossil fuels in line with scientific pathways. We must accelerate the adoption of renewable energy sources, such as solar and wind, while ensuring that everyone, regardless of where they live, can have access to clean energy. And we must ensure that this transition is just and doesn't leave anyone behind. But here's the catch. Ambitious climate goals only happen if they are adequately funded. As major providers of capital, financial institutions, so asset managers, pension funds, banks, insurers, etc., have a key role to play. They must reallocate the capital that they currently use to fund polluting activities towards green technologies and projects instead. But is that what's happening? Not quite. Through the research that we publish at ShareAction, we have seen some notable improvements over the last couple of years. Let me give you a few examples that happened in the banking sector. When I started working on banks in 2019, no mainstream European bank had committed to net zero by 2050. Now, all of Europe's largest 25 banks have made such a commitment. No mainstream bank had set targets to reduce their exposure to high carbon activities. Now that number is 80%. And less than half of Europe's largest banks had committed to phase out from coal by specific dates. Now, over 3/4 of Europe's largest banks have done so. So that's encouraging. But the problem is that these commitments on their own are nowhere near enough to avert the climate crisis that we are rapidly heading towards. And that's because their pledges often include important loopholes that allow banks to continue financing activities that go counter to the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. For example, last year, the world's largest 60 global banks, including Barclays and HSBC here in the UK, poured more than $600 billion into expanding the capacity of fossil fuel production, despite the accelerating climate crisis, according to a report called Banking on Climate Chaos. Similar trends can be observed in the asset management and pension fund industries. So in other words, and as a colleague from ActionAid recently told The Guardian, money is meant to make the world go round, but if anything, it's making the world go backward. So how can financial institutions help avert the climate crisis? And what can you do about it? Financial institutions have a crucial role to play, as I said, and they can in averting the climate crisis, and they can do that in 3 key ways. The first one is a little bit obvious. They can spend their money on climate-friendly projects and businesses. The second one is that they can undertake what we call good stewardship. And the third one is that they can use their political clout to drive regulatory change. But let's start with the first one. Financial institutions can influence the climate by spending their money on climate-friendly activities, such as a new wind turbine or more energy-efficient homes, and refusing to give money to polluting activities, such as fossil fuels or a new highway. At the moment, financial institutions want to have their cake and eat it too. They know that climate-friendly projects and businesses present an important commercial opportunity, and they have steadily ramped up their financing of these activities over the last few years. In the banking sector, most of Europe's largest banks now have a sustainable finance or green finance target in place. Some of them go in the trillions. But the issue is that they're also reluctant to let go of the businesses of the past. And just to give you a sense of scale, a recent report by an NGO called Sierra Club showed that less than 10% of banks' energy financing was going towards renewable energy activities. That gives you a sense of their priorities. And that has to change. The good news is that good stewardship can be a way to achieve that. By owning stakes in companies or providing financing to them, financial institutions can use their influence to encourage these companies to make climate-conscious decisions. So, for example, if a pension fund owns shares in a company, it will have access to the board in a way that other institutions will not have. They will also be given rights, such as the right to appoint board members or decide key aspects of the company's climate strategy. Let me give you a concrete example of how this works in practice and how that can lead to material change in companies' climate strategies. Here at ShareAction, we work with shareholders of the companies that we target to add credibility and weight to the climate asks that we're making of companies. The shareholders that we work with include big asset managers such as Amundi, smaller asset managers that are slightly more ethically oriented, pension funds, insurers, and retail investors. And collaborating with those shareholders has helped us land important wins for the climate. A few years ago, we worked with a coalition of shareholders that wanted Tesco to fully decarbonize the electricity that it consumes. It wasn't a small ask, given that at the time, Tesco consumed around 1% of the electricity produced in the UK. We coordinated a letter from the shareholders, making our asks clear to the company. We organized and chaired meetings between investors and Tesco. And finally, we spoke at their annual general meeting, publicly calling on them to decarbonize their electricity. Little did we know that the sustainability team at Tesco had been pushing a similar agenda to ours. The fact that shareholders publicly backed the asks that they were making of their senior management team helped elevate and gave weight to these discussions. And within a year, Tesco committed to sourcing all of its electricity from renewable energy sources. Another example, this time in the banking sector, concerns HSBC and oil and gas. You might remember that a couple of years ago, global energy watchdog, the International Energy Agency, concluded that there was no room for new oil and gas for a 50% chance of meeting the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement. So what we did is that in 2022, we teamed up with a group of shareholders, including retail shareholders that only had a few shares in the company, but also huge shareholders, including managers and pension funds. And interestingly, given that we're in Islington Council Pension Fund actually supported our engagement. And what we did is that we were able to use our rights as shareholders by putting a motion forward that asked HSBC to improve its stance on oil and gas. And we were able to call a vote on that motion. The bank really did not want the vote to go ahead and instead sat down at the negotiation table with us. As you might imagine, we spent quite a few stressful months negotiating quite hard with the bank. But we reached a stage where we felt that we could withdraw our motion because HSBC committed to engaging with us constructively and giving us access to their decision-making forum. At the end of last year, in response to that engagement, HSBC committed not to finance new oil and gas fields anymore. That was really important symbolically. It was the world's largest bank to have ever made such a commitment. And since then, we've seen similarly big European banks made such commitments. Finally, I'll just end with a small example to illustrate that the work that we do at ShareAction is not just UK focused. We focus on sectors and companies across the globe. And recently, we led an engagement with Dutch chemicals giant LyondellBasell, which announced new, more ambitious decarbonization targets following months of engagement with ourselves and the investors that we work with. So, good stewardship can have a material impact on companies' climate strategies. But when it doesn't, we think that financial institutions should take their money and invest it elsewhere. And when the problem is one that touches an entire sector, or when companies and financial institutions are unable to act because of a regulatory gap, we think that they should use their voice to drive change at the policy level. I understand that some companies might feel uneasy about the idea, but climate change is inherently a political issue. Indeed, it's the issue of our time. It's the defining issue of our time. Some political leaders have made climate change a core part of their manifesto in response to mobilization by millions of citizens across the globe, demanding greater climate action. But the problem is that many of them still don't, or are backtracking on previous climate commitments. I won't name names. Financial institutions, who tend to be important employers and providers of capital, have political clout. They should use it to ensure that governments introduce legislation that accelerate the transition to a socially and climate-friendly world. At the moment, this is not quite happening. You might be familiar with the work of British NGO Influence Map, who assesses the lobbying activities of companies across sectors. What they found is that many financial institutions are actually actively standing in the way of ambitious legislation on climate change, despite their pledges to go green. They can do so directly by engaging with governments on a one-to-one basis, or they can do it through their trade associations. Some consumer brands, such as Unilever, have already started using their political clout to call for better regulation on climate. So there is absolutely no reason for financial institutions not to do the same. So I hope I've convinced you that financial institutions have a key role to play to avert the climate crisis, and that they have many tools at their disposal to do so. But the question is, what can we, as citizens, do about it? The links between your personal finance and the climate emergency may not be as obvious as other examples of climate action. However, the money that you have in your bank account, your pension, and your personal investments can have a significant impact on the environment. As consumers with the power to invest, the decisions that you make about where your money goes can be surprisingly influential. Or financial institutions will shape the future, whether we want it or not, and it's up to us to hold them accountable for making choices that benefit both our wallets and the planet that we all call home. We can hold them accountable as consumers, both at the individual and business level, by choosing to work with and invest our money in financial institutions that don't fund fossil fuels and instead fund climate solutions. We can do this as employees by ensuring that our company's pension funds is an ethical one, or by engaging with our pension fund to demand that they engage robustly with the companies that they own. We can do this as shareholders by turning up to the annual general meetings of companies that we hold and publicly ask boards to do more on climate. We can do this as political actors by demanding that the people that represent us in Parliament introduce regulations that accelerate the transition to net zero. In short, we have the power. So let's work together to ensure that our money supports a sustainable and thriving future for all. Thank you.
Jeanne, thank you very much indeed. We do have time for a couple of quick questions. We have one at the front straight away, and the mic is appearing from the back of the room. just at the front in the pink shirt here.
Hi, thank you very much. It's very interesting what you're doing as citizens, what we can influence. So my question is about COP26. If you got any reflections on that, and are you going to do anything in COP28 to push the agenda forward?
Yeah. So, sorry, you want reflections on
the GFANs on kind of COP26
okay,
and where they
that
are,
sounds
and
good. Yeah, so for those that do not know, COP26 obviously was hosted by the UK, took place in Glasgow, and one of the key themes was the private sector, more specifically financial institutions, and what can they do to accelerate the transition to net zero. And that saw the launch of many voluntary initiatives, including, as you were saying, GFANS, which stands for the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which was this, I guess, monster voluntary initiative that acted as an umbrella for many sub-initiatives, one of which was the Net Zero Banking Alliance. And I guess my reflections are that this sort of momentum is really positive because it brought lots of companies to the table. It saw record numbers of financial institutions commit to net zero by 2050 and committing to set targets, at least one climate target for a carbon-intensive sector. That's good. We need to see that positive momentum happening. The issue is that the ambition levels weren't quite right, in our opinion. And the guidelines that were published by these voluntary initiatives left a lot of room for financial institutions to decide really what they wanted to do. So I think really important in terms of signaling, it's, you know, that sort of thing is really helps create the political space for governments to then introduce more ambitious legislation, but on its own completely insufficient. And indeed, we published an analysis a year after COP26, analysing how financial institutions, especially banks, had implemented the commitments that they had made at COP26. And again, we found quite a lot of greenwashing going on. In terms of our plans for COP28, at ShareAction, we don't tend to attend COPs very much because we don't follow kind of international diplomacy. Obviously, the conclusions that are made at these COP are important to our work, but we don't actively try and influence those. We do engage with policymakers, but we tend to engage on issues such as fiduciary duty, double materiality, whether financial institutions should be publishing transition plans, that sort of thing.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. We've got time for one more, just on the aisle there in the black.
Hi, I'm interested in like a company, for example, has got a clear net zero plan, but their banking or their company pension is invested into fossil fuels, and it's not showing the carbon emissions of where their money is being invested. Do you think that's going to change? Because that somebody's saying that they're being really sustainable, and yet they're banking with Barclays, and the emissions of that can be, 7 times the total emissions of the company? Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And indeed, that's something that is increasingly being discussed in the business community. I don't know if you saw, but there was a report published by the Carbon Safe Lending Network on exactly that issue. I think it was called Carbon Bankrolling or something like that. But it was making the case that those emissions should have a category of their own, and that companies should start reporting on those, because as you say, they can have really good strategies themselves, but if they bank with the wrong bank, they're still indirectly responsible. I think what's interesting is in the more grassroots community, that is also being discussed. And in the past year, we saw a campaign by a group called Fossil Free London targeting Bloom & Wild, the flower company, because they bank with Barclays. And Barclays is one of Europe's largest fossil fuel financiers. And Barclays was using them as an example of the great companies that it finances. And it does finance great companies, but it also finances pretty horrible companies. And so that led to quite an interesting discussion about what bank you should choose. So, yeah, no, great question.
Do you think it will change, though? Do you think that that we will start to have the emissions of the finance within companies so that it's transparent for everyone to see?
I hope we will. I don't know at what pace. I feel like it's a little bit complicated. I think some corporate actors could bank with any bank, but here at ShareAction, one of the groups that we coordinate is a group of universities that are interested in responsible investment. And they have quite an interesting mix of assets because they don't only hold equity, but they also hold land and lots of other assets. And the truth is that more ethical banks don't cater to their needs, and so they have to bank with bigger banks. And so I guess the question is, ideally we would have those disclosures, but I guess we should make sure that it doesn't backfire, because if a company cannot bank with anybody else, a discussion could be had about what realistically they can do.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for your questions, and thank you, Jeanne, for your time. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you very much.